Welcome to The Riff, where writer and investor Byrne Hobart and I discuss the major inflection points caused by technological change. Our weekly conversation covers the obvious and not so obvious ways in which markets and businesses will adapt as a result. Let's jump right in.
Hey, Byrne.
Hey.
Hello. It's Inauguration Day today. Trump coin is down. Melania coin is up. I know you're, a huge holder of both. Just kidding. But you did write about, maybe that's a good segue to meme markets. You have been looking a little bit at them.
Yeah, I would say I am not at all looking at them as, an important asset class that should be added to the mix. But I think they're an interesting phenomenon because there's always been some element of just self-expression in markets. And people like to have a portfolio that they think says something about them. And you can kind of look at, so there are these debates about ESG and sin stocks, where one of the claims, part of the core claim of the recent ESG movement is they're actually doing things that have higher returns. That if you invest in a bunch of companies that pollute a lot, that these companies will eventually have very low margins because they will get the tax structure will incorporate the negative externality of pollution. And so they will have a bunch of stranded assets that don't produce very good returns compared to the previous expectations. So that's like one version of ESG. And then there's another version, which is just you can admit that maybe oil and gas and coal and private prisons and gambling, that these are all good, profitable, good businesses in just the financial sense, and they're profitable, and that you should accept a lower return in exchange for doing more virtuous things. So you can basically think of that as like a component of the return. So you invest in something like Tesla and you say, well, I'll get less than S&P level returns because this is pretty overpriced. On the other hand, I value just the idea of backing an electric vehicle company at 2% a year, and so I'll accept a 2% lower return in exchange for owning it. Or now you say, I believe that there's a moral imperative to donate as much money as humanly possible to Donald Trump. And so that's why I'm investing in Tesla, so that my money turns into Elon's balance sheet, which turns into margin loans, which turns into Trump donations and Twitter acquisitions and things like that. So there have always been people who have a portfolio where the portfolio is going to have a lower return. They're okay with that at some level because they think that it's just a cool portfolio to have. And meme stocks are just the furthest extreme of that, where there aren't any, or like meme coins. Meme stocks do often have fundamentals, and often the meme starts with people getting excited about the fundamentals and then shifts to people getting excited about the meme. And with meme coins, you start with the excitement and then you turn it into a financial asset, and people trade it. There was a weird thing when I was reading about Pump.fun, and I was just trying to understand how the economics work. And I find these descriptions of a bonding curve where it was painted as like this incredibly complicated thing and really elaborate, and it's not. It's basically just an order book where if you buy more, you are buying from this centralized liquidity provider. And if you want to buy more, you have to pay a higher price than the last person who bought. And then if you sell, the price goes down. So it's just a mechanism for somewhat decentralizing that liquidity provision. And that seems not especially complicated. But what meme markets do that I do find interesting is they are basically a way for people to take the general social media competition to be just like the first person to riff interestingly on something and turn it into more of a legible, measurable competition. So whenever there's some event on Twitter, and the example I gave in the post was, okay, every couple months, the oldest person alive dies. And it's just just actuarially, that's what has to happen. And every time the oldest living person dies, someone will retweet that with the caption, vaxxed. And it's funny every time. But there is this race to be the first person to say that, or the first person to make some other joke that only applies to this particular world's oldest person dies story and wouldn't apply before. And when you watch this, it is a competition. Like everyone wants to be first, or a lot of people want to be first. And if they can't be first, they want to be best. And there's some trade-off between first and best, where if it takes you a couple minutes to come up with a really good joke. Maybe that joke actually goes more viral than just the vaxxed joke, but you also spent that time not tweeting vaxxed, and so you missed out. So like it is a competition, and anytime there is a competition, people do want to have some set of rules that allows them to know who actually won. And meme coins are just a way to quantify how first were you and how best were you at figuring out that this particular meme was going to be interesting and exciting to people. So there's still no economic substance. Like there is no DCF valuation that's going to tell you when hawk to a coin or whatever quant coin it was where someone rugged, like it was rugged by an elementary school student. There's no real analysis that you can do other than knowing something about the life cycle of memes. And then you have this interesting reflexive dynamic where suddenly the existence of the meme coin becomes part of the meme itself. So it is incredibly far removed from the usual function of financial markets, which is providing capital to businesses, providing liquidity to the earlier generation of capital providers, and giving some kind of publicly visible signal of what different businesses are worth and where investments in real capital can produce the largest financial returns. Pretty far removed from that, but it is kind of hard to draw the line somewhere and say, like, this particular financial market function is so abstract that it has nothing to do with the actual purpose of financial markets, and therefore we have to ban it, or at least look askance at it. Like there's no particular point on the continuum where you can say that. It's always adjacent to something with a little bit more substance, and that is just what a lot of other parts of the financial market are, is that they have a little bit less substance, but they're adjacent to something with more substance. They provide some kind of liquidity, and that liquidity does ultimately mean that the assets that do actually have value have some slightly more efficient pricing. So don't touch meme coins. They are just kind of stupid, but they're stupid in an interesting way. They are a particular kind of stupidity that could only exist in specific contexts. And then that brings us to the Trump coin thing, which is in many ways just completely insane. He drops this announcement on the Friday afternoon before Inauguration Monday, and immediately it is most of his net worth. And he was not an impoverished guy. I'm sure he exaggerates his net worth to this day, but still, I have no idea what the thing, like, even if you take the maximally cynical thing of, okay, he is going to dump all of his Trump coins, he's going to have that money. Well, what at this point, what does he do with that money? His expenses are pretty much paid for by the federal government. And he did have enough money to live a very comfortable, very gold-plated lifestyle beforehand. So I have no idea what the point of that was, other than just a weird flex and a way for him to tell the SEC that all bets are off, everything is legal now, and we're going to have a really, really fun time over the next 4 years, just, one crazy headline after another.
Yeah, I do wonder what those conversations were like that, where he pulled the trigger on, him and Melania. It seems insane. Biology has been saying that we're going to just have sort of just such a radical pendulum shift, and the sort of like, it sort of became the self-fulfilling prophecy that the stuff that the left was concerned about is actually going to come true, or some of it, because they were the boy who cried wolf on so many things. Now they can't cry wolf anymore, and there really is no checks and balances, or far fewer, on Trump himself, but also on some of his movement. And he predicts we're going to be entering just sort of, some people call this the woke right, but just sort of like whatever the phenomenon that wokeness was to the left, that on the right, in terms of not really checks and balances, just kind of unfettered, extremity.
Yeah, I think one point to make there is that if you think that if there's some political issue where there's something that happens on a continuum, and we're arguing over where we want to be on the continuum, if you are genuinely convinced that the other side is genuinely convinced that the slippery slope fallacy is not a fallacy, then from your perspective, it is no longer a fallacy. In other words, every time you shift the precedence over, if you think that the other side is always going to shift the precedent slightly in their direction, every time you shift it in the correct direction from your perspective, you are making things better off, and you are mitigating some really important risk. So, if you look at something like abortion, if you have the view that there's one side that's going to just completely ban it totally if they ever get a chance to, and then if people on that side or just on the more restrictive side have the view of the other side will allow abortions at any time, under any circumstances, they'll all be federally funded, and every medical provider will have to provide them, whether or not they have personal ethical issues around that. If each side thinks that that's how the other side views things, then for each side, it is actually pretty imperative to even push things further in their direction than they actually prefer, just because they know that at some point there will be some backsliding and they don't think there's any real limit to that backsliding. So if that is just a general way that political behavior will show up, that if you think that the slippery slope, if you think that there's a slippery slope on the other side, then you should act as if there is in fact a slippery slope on your side. Then you will tend to have more extreme swings whenever power changes hands, and it is much easier to convince yourself that the other side, there's actually no limit to how far they'll go if you are in any kind of social media echo chamber where you tend to hear the smartest views from your side and the most insane things that anyone who's nominally on the other side has ever come up with. It is really interesting to me that it's gotten harder and harder to parody things on Twitter because A, there is someone who probably believes that, and B, your side is not actually necessarily going to notice that you are making fun of your own views or somebody else's views. Like there will be people who, if they don't actually agree with you, will at least treat pretty extreme claims as if they're made 100% in earnest. So I do think we need to bring back irony and bring back bipartisanship, or the variance in policy will just get unnecessarily extreme.
Yeah, I do remember in the 2020 era, there was this account, Titania McGrath, that would say, skiing is racist or biking is racist. Everything they said was racist, only to find that there would be like a New York, it was like predictive actually. A New York Times article would come out saying, hey, there are differential outcomes based, on skiing or Burning Man or whatever. But yes, that is a call to arms there. Is there anything more worth or just reflecting on inauguration or sort of what you'll be curious to watch as Trump takes office?
Yeah, I am very curious about how long the current mood will be sustained on the right, because the right has been selected for this very oppositional culture for a while, or at least the oppositional side of right-wing political culture has done very, very well over the last a decade plus. And I think under the first Trump administration, there were definitely cases where it was hard to implement policy because the people who would actually do the specific implementations of that policy were either pretty left-leaning themselves or more establishment conservative. And so there was this sense that, Trump is gripping this steering wheel, but it's actually a self-driving car, and the computer is just steering in a completely different direction or in a mostly different direction, and is just only occasionally sort of incrementally responding to what Trump is trying to do. And I think there's just enough awareness on the right and in Trump's orbit that you actually have to have people who are pretty aligned with what you want to do at all levels of the org chart, or at some point, the message just does not get transmitted to the person who would actually need to change what they do in their day job in order to make this policy take effect. So I think, in maybe in some sense, the Trump team too is just more sophisticated about how policy actually gets implemented and how Washington, D.C. actually works. On the other hand, as has been the case for a while, Trump is older, he's slowing down. I think a lot of the people who surround him, they are thinking about what does their career look like after this, that Trump is presumably not running in 2028. We'll see who does end up running in 2028. But there's going to be a long post-Trump period. And the political pendulum does swing. It doesn't just go one way and then stay there. So they will at some point be asked why they supported particular things in this period, and they'll have to have really good answers. And it is what I think that selects for is a certain kind of pragmatism, where if you are looking at the entire menu of Trump policies, you can ask yourself, okay, which of these is reasonably popular and also an actual problem that does need to get solved? And that's the one that you actually want to focus on. And the other stuff, maybe it's fun. It's certainly something that Trump will enjoy tweeting about and commenting on. But if the policy either will not get enacted or just couldn't possibly get enacted, or it'll happen and it'll be this kind of irrelevant thing, like, yeah, we'll update some maps, we'll put Gulf of America instead of Gulf of Mexico, and you're not going to be able to coast on having contributed to that at all in your future career. And in fact, a lot of those kind of cosmetic things, Trump will want full credit, and he will get full credit, and nobody, while Trump is alive, will be able to say, oh yeah, that was my idea, I told Donald Trump to do this, and then I told him how to get it done. Trump will just remember things differently and say so. So I guess the opportunities for sort of policy entrepreneurs on the right would be looking at things like, what is the structure of global trade right now? If you have something of a popular mandate and you understand a little bit better how the system works, and also the world is more in flux and it's more of a bipartisan issue, that the US should not be completely dependent on one hostile superpower for a lot of important manufactured goods, basically none of which are impossible to get outside of China, but basically all of which are more expensive if you source them from anywhere but China. And there are actually useful things to do there. There are actually numbers to crunch, and you can start plugging things into spreadsheets and asking how many fabs should there be in the US, and how should we subsidize those, and who should get those checks, and what will they do next once they get those checks, et cetera. Like those are actually important questions of substance, and the people who work on those will be able to point to specific tangible accomplishments. Their campaign ads will actually have the nice drone video of this giant chip fab in a place that previously had nothing, and that'd be a worthwhile compliment. And that is also the kind of thing that someone who is right-leaning or even not right-leaning, but is in the general DC matrix, like, they can feel pretty good about their day job doing that and focus less on the other stuff. And I think this is in politics, there is sometimes this level of this kind of purist view of if someone has one set of policies that we just find deeply reprehensible and another set that we think is just kind of okay and normal and prudent, or like, even if that's not exactly how it should be done, this is the kind of thing the government should do. There is some hesitancy to say, I'm going to wash my hands of this and not participate at all. But then you are either ceding everything to your ideological enemies, or you're ceding everything to complete sociopaths who they know just as well as you do that this is evil. They just don't care at all. So you do want some level of participation for people who are not fully on the Trump train. I hope they don't all leave Washington, D.C. forever. But I also recognize that they will be constrained in what they can do, and they're probably not going to feel good every single day about the organization they work for. But it's a big country. The federal government is this enormous institution, the most powerful institution on earth, and it needs a lot of human capital to function even somewhat well. And so it's going to have a lot of people who voted different ways and who are just going to focus on what if America really needs to secure its supply of asparagus or solar panels or whatever other product it is, like, that's what they're going to do. And the other stuff they will just try not to think too much about.
Yeah. It's interesting. By the way, side note, Curtis Yarvin was just interviewed in the New York Times, which feels like a sort of I don't even know how to describe it, but inconceivable a few years ago.
It does feel like the kind of thing where someone would have photoshopped that and posted it on Twitter in 2015, and everyone would have thought this was a really, really funny joke, and that was the end of it. In fact, I'm sure that if you search for something like Curtis Yarvin New York Times interview on Twitter, you could probably scroll past everything that came out this weekend and find all the people joking about this, because it was obviously a punchline that would never actually happen.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. Most of you probably know how much the Turpentine team loves Notion, the sponsor of today's episode. We use it every day for editorial planning, transcript markups, project managing, knowledge sharing, and it's where I drop random 3 a.m. ideas that turn into episodes. Now it has the power of AI, built right inside of Notion and woven across our entire workspace. It's been a total game changer for our productivity and focus. We just used it the other day to architect the content schedule for next month across our network. Notion combines your notes, docs, and projects into one space that's simple and beautifully designed. The fully integrated Notion AI helps you work faster, write better, and think bigger, doing tasks that normally take you hours in just seconds. Try Notion for free when you go to notion.com/upstreampod. That's all lowercase letters. Notion.com/upstreampod to try the powerful, easy to use Notion AI today. And when you use our link, you're supporting our show. That's notion.com/upstreampod.
Trust isn't just earned, it's demanded. Whether you're a startup founder navigating your first audit or a seasoned security professional scaling your GRC program, proving your commitment to security has never been more critical or more complex. That's where Vanta comes in. Businesses use Vanta to establish trust by automating compliance needs across over 35 frameworks like SOC 2 and ISO 27001. Centralize security workflows, complete questionnaires up to 5 times faster, and proactively manage vendor risk. Vanta can help you start or scale your security programming by connecting you with auditors and experts to conduct your audit and set up your security program quickly. Plus, with automation and AI throughout the platform, Vanta gives you time back so you can focus on building your company. Join over 9,000 global companies like Atlassian, Quora, and Factory who use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. For a limited time, listeners get $1,000 off Vanta at vanta.com/revolution. That's VANTA.com/revolution for $1,000 off.
Yeah, totally. I remember I interviewed him a few years ago, and people were like, "Oh my God, how could you? Are you nervous? Are you scared?" It'll be interesting. When also I was speaking of biology, I was just having a disagreement with him where he was reflecting on sort of the brouhaha over the holiday between sort of the tech right and the MAGA right as sort of evidence that Trump's base, in his view, is sort of increasingly nativist and increasingly putting pressure on him to become that way as well. And to which I disagreed and said, no, Trump is a cult of personality. His base sort of adopts to him more so than the other way around, or at least tolerate. And so I sort of saw that sort of skirmish, and then as sort of reifying the power of Trump and Elon and the alignment that they have in sort of being pro high skilled immigration rather than being, a sign of more conflict to come, and that Trump is, going to be hostage to his base. Rather, he sets the terms and the base reacts rather than the other way around. I'm curious if you have a perspective on that.
Yeah, I think just in strict GDP terms, high skill immigration is valuable, makes the economy bigger, and there are questions about just how that plays out over very long periods. But I think the other the thing to be realistic about is the U.S. is a very, very rich country. The U.S. will still be a rich country if it doesn't take every single choice that maximizes growth. I think there are a lot more growth maximizing choices that the U.S. should take. But there's also, I think the serious policy question is, okay, what are the actual pluses and minuses? And a lot of the minuses are pretty straightforward to calculate. Like you look at the fraction of big tech companies that were started by immigrants, you look at the fraction of STEM degrees that are granted to first and second generation immigrants, and you just see that a lot of the high income human capital in the U.S. did come from either is first or second generation immigrants, but also that the U.S. does produce a lot of this talent on its own, and that there are a lot of people who are descended from who are third and fourth and fifth generation immigrants who are also perfectly capable of doing these things. And so I think there's always this hope in politics that you will just find this low-hanging fruit, that there will be some big EMH violation, and that we can simultaneously eliminate all high-skill immigration and 2x the rate of GDP growth, and it just isn't so. But it's also not the case that we need to do every single policy that maximizes GDP growth. And we just know that's fairly true because there are plenty of dumb things that, plenty of dumb rules that constrain growth in other ways. But I don't know. I think that discussion is probably going to happen in Signal chats that that not everyone is invited to, and that those chats, that's where the policy actually gets hashed out. And then whatever the public narrative is, whether that narrative is Trump saying, he loves immigrants and he married one, and, he wants to bring, he thinks the biggest problem with the U.S. immigration system is we don't have enough, we need, 10 Jensen Hongs, and we can get them. If he says that, or if he says, no, we've had enough of immigration, legal and illegal, we're going to just, stop it all until someone finds out what the hell is going on, or however he originally phrased that ban. I think the policy that gets enacted and the justification for it is going to be something that's kind of cobbled together after the fact from what are, I'm sure, pretty vigorous internal debates. And it's also the case that there are plenty of people who are both have the status of they're first generation immigrant, and they're also pretty skeptical of mass immigration, and can articulate exactly why that is. And I think that it is entirely possible that that's where a lot of the debate will be. It will be first generation immigrants who are Trump aligned, saying here is, that it was like they're glad they're here, but that they also feel like there are loopholes, or like it's just not an optimal policy overall. And then probably the people on the other side of that debate are more likely to be, are like the people who are like the public face of the other side of the debate may be more likely to be just like native born, part of the general progressive leaning, high socioeconomic status upper crust. So it'll be kind of funny to watch that. If nothing else, the slight misalignment between direct personal interest and these abstract political philosophies. But that's also just part of the fun of politics, is that sometimes you do find people who are arguing totally against their own interest, and sometimes it's because they have this earnest view, and sometimes it's because the whole thing is a LARP. You never really know. Like what I personally try to do is like I recognize that there's always going to be this incredibly strong temptation to argue in my own economic self-interest. And so the only acceptable thing to do, if you think that you are reasonably articulate and reasonably persuasive, is you have to actually arrange your life so that your economic interests are very closely tied to what is to the good of the nation. And but I think that's that's very inconvenient to do, but it also does mean that you get the good kind of hypocrisy where you are advocating for your own interests, but those are actually good interests to have. And if other people had those interests too, the world would be a better place. So it's also there's probably some kind of conservation of hypocrisy at work, where you're just always going to be tempted to argue in favor of things that would make you personally richer and higher status and more important. And if you know that that's true, then just make sure that you're the kind of person who should be richer, higher status, and more important.
Yeah, it is interesting. There was this book a long time ago, I don't know if you remember it, called What's the Matter with Kansas, where an economist went to, in his view, try to figure out why there was a set of working class people who, in his view, were voting against their own interests. And his conclusion was that they were using the social issues, social conservatism, the abortion, sort of gay marriage, sort of topics as ways to hook these people to the Republican Party, even though, again, in Thomas Frank's view, they were voting against their interests when it came to economic issues like deregulation and kind of, I guess, other free market or sort of market maximizing initiatives. But of course, that took a lot of confidence on Thomas Frank's view, aside that he knew what was in fact best for these people.
Yeah, like I think there's always going to be some of that, and if you have a political system that causes there to be two big parties, you'll probably have these parties consist of coalitions that are a little bit rickety and don't have a lot of internal ideological coherence. Because anytime you end up with a setup where it's like 53-47 instead of 50-50 in terms of public support, weighted for swing state status, then you create huge upside for someone to defect from one coalition and move to the other one and flip that coalition to being competitive or even dominant. So the equilibrium is that these coalitions form based on two sets of views that are cumulatively roughly equally popular, but where the individual viewpoints don't necessarily have a lot to do with one another. Now, it's easier if they do have a lot to do with one another, and you will often find that people try to kind of bring them together, and they try to say that, okay, we're socially progressive because we care a lot about human rights, and because we care so much about people, we're also going to ensure that there's a broad safety net and that you never have to declare medical bankruptcy, and you're basically taken care of in old age, etc. And there is some level of internal coherence there, and there's some level of internal coherence on the right, which is we believe in a lot of traditional things. This is the way, like this is a very time-tested approach to running an economy. This is a very time-tested approach to social arrangements. But there is also this sense of like marriage, a marriage with children, you're sort of creating this miniature socialist economy within your household, and then participating in a capitalist one outside of it. So you're like a little, a very, very tiny Norway, if you're lucky. And that, maybe that's a contradiction, or maybe you can turn around and say, no, I think that socialism works perfectly well if everyone is either in love or is a blood relative, and that it works really, really badly when you extend it beyond that. So if we're not all going to become one big national polycule, then we're probably going to have to be a lot more capitalist. So there are sometimes these kind of external contradictions, but I also like sometimes people just vote in a principled way, and I think plenty of people in blue states vote for higher taxes, knowing that they themselves will have less money to spend because they actually think it's the right thing to do, and that similarly, someone in Kansas might vote against a law that makes it easier to join a union, knowing that that union would raise my wages, but I don't like the idea of getting paid more because I joined a union. Like I like the idea of getting paid more because I worked hard and got ahead myself. And I think those are pretty valid. And I think if you try to simplify it and you try to ask yourself, like, why are these people actually wrong, or why are they crazy, instead of asking, what can we understand about their underlying preferences? Because there's going to be a bit of both. In some cases, people just don't, like, I'm sure most people do not fully understand what they're voting for. There was a funny anecdote a while ago about how conservative campaigners in swing states had to understate some of the social issue stuff because it was just too wild. And I think that was very much this emergent property from the relative youth of a lot of political staffers, and the fact that on the right, there is more of a tendency for, like, if someone goes into Republican politics, they are probably just a very establishment kind of person. And they are probably just pretty, on a personal level, reluctant to rock the boat. And if you go into progressive politics, you're probably not very much of an establishment person, or you're kind of a quasi-establishment person who can signal anti-establishment tendencies. And so there is some selection for just more extreme views on that side. I think that, like, one of the ways to think about it is, like, from what I understand, most conservative staffers were a little bit to the left of their constituents, and then historically most progressive staffers were also a bit to the left of their constituents. That is probably much less true than it was a few years ago. I think there are a lot more people who are very ideologically committed to Trumpism, have gone into politics specifically to make that happen, and may view Trump as a little bit squishy on some issues. Because I think there's a set of people who are sort of Trumpy in the sense of they like certain aspects of Trump's personality. And there are people who are Trumpy in the sense of, if Trump has had 50 opinions about any given issue, which he's had 50 opinions about every issue, they will take the most right-wing one and say that is the actual Trump stance and everything else is politics. But this is the actual belief system. And so they're like Trumpier than Trump on every axis on which Trump could be Trumpy. And those people, they exist, but you can be alarmed by that, but you can also take comfort in the fact that this kind of selection was happening in progressive spaces for a pretty long time, and the country did not fall apart. Like, there were some bad policies enacted, some good policies enacted, certainly a lot of policies that Republicans would not prefer, but you didn't have mass Republican immigration to Hungary or Singapore or something specifically in response to Biden or Obama policies. The U.S. is still a really good place to live, even if your side lost the last election.
Agreed. I want to segue to another topic, although it's related, industrial policy. I hosted this debate between Scott Sumner and Noah Smith the other day, and Scott Sumner was sort of, making the case against industrial policy and for sort of, more free market oriented policies. And Noah said, hey, Scott, the world in which you grew up in and were an economist in is in a different world in which we live now, which is that we have an adversary, China, which manufactures more than we do and more than our allies do combined. And that is we haven't had that since the post World War II era. And that that creates a certain level of military risks or dependencies or that we can't afford to have anymore. Do you basically have the same view, or where do you stand on sort of the industrial policy?
Yeah, I think this is another case where there are just very unavoidable inefficiencies in capital allocation when the government does it. And so you are accepting a lower rate of GDP growth next year if you have more industrial policy. But you are probably also, if it's done right, you are reducing some of the long-term risks to that growth and to American standard of living, and you're reducing some geopolitical risk. Like, you really don't want to be in a situation where China realizes that if there ever is a war with the U.S. will run out of ammunition first, and then that'll be it. And I have no idea what the actual calculation would look like there, and I also suspect that in the event that it looked like an actual war were more likely, that the U.S. would be able to step up production very, very quickly. That is something the U.S. has a good track record of doing. But it it is really, really hard to write good industrial policy. But I think one of the cases in favor of industrial policy is that the U.S., in effect, does have an industrial policy. It's written in Beijing. It is not written with American interests in mind. And it's not written with the interests of the average Chinese person in mind. It's written in order to secure the long-term dominance of the CCP in China. But that is not something that's not entirely in U.S. interest. I think another piece to think about is that one of the reasons that industrial policy is really hard is that market signals are pretty great at telling you what to do next and telling you where there should be more capital, where there should be less capital. But market signals will sometimes mess up if there is some kind of J curve of value added, where if you invest a bit in this industry, the returns go down over time. But then at some point, the industry creates enough positive externalities that returns start to go up over time. Like there's a J curve with respect to the return on education, where in any given year, if you don't drop out of school and you just if you drop out of school and get a job in construction or DoorDash or whatever, your income does go up. But over a long period, if that's the set of skills that you've developed and you don't either invest your own time in developing other skills, or invest time plus money in having someone else confer those skills and give you a better personal network, and also give you a certificate that says, yes, this person is capable of whatever the domain specific skills are entailed by that degree, that eventually that does reduce your income. So where I think industrial policy could be pretty exciting is that there are going to be a lot of intermediate goods where the U.S. would be able to produce more interesting end products if it were easier to source some of these intermediate products. And a lot of those products are sourced overseas. And China has actually done a really good job of managing this transition from being a very poor country that competes purely on labor costs to being a middle income country that competes on some combination of labor cost and very high very high existing capital investment, and the state's willingness to accept lower standards of living for the average Chinese worker in exchange for higher market share in particular categories of exports. So that's what the U.S. is competing against. And if you're competing against someone who is internally subsidizing things, but you just can't countenance a world where those things are only produced in China, then you have to subsidize them yourself. And when you do that, you are spending taxpayer money, and you're spending it in order to produce something that already exists and to initially produce it at a higher cost, and probably indefinitely to produce it at a somewhat higher cost, because U.S. labor costs will be higher than China's, hopefully, over the rest of my lifetime. So you're accepting lower growth there. You're allocating capital away from something that has higher returns, like B2B SaaS, and towards something like building particular kinds of screws in the US and making sure that we could still make the screws even if the ships are not crossing the Pacific anymore. But that does mean that now a US customer who needs that particular input, that particular intermediate good, they can be a lot more confident that their supply is not going to be cut off. And you're also bringing some of the skills that are adjacent to that back to the US, and you are just dragging that supply chain closer to the US. So maybe that factory ends up buying more US made machine tools, and it's of course hiring more US labor, and maybe that leads to other factories coming into existence. So there is definitely a cost to this. And I think this is another case where you just don't want to deny that there is a cost. Like there's the counterfactual world where we don't do industrial policy is a counterfactual world where consumer spending is a little bit higher. You can buy more stuff in the next year, but it's also a world where you have more lingering doubts about how long that standard of living will be high. And the U.S. consumption is subsidized by the global demand for saving in safe assets, which means dollar-denominated assets. And at some point, if the rest of the world does outgrow the U.S., which is not happening right now, but if in the event that it starts to happen persistently, then over time, it just becomes harder to see the U.S. dollar as the low-risk asset. And so to preserve some of that, you do want to ensure that in some very concrete sense, the U.S. is an economy that can continue to produce stuff that the rest of the world wants.
Speaking of counterfactuals, when people would make the argument for why we should have free trade, even though China doesn't, they'll say, oh, well, they're doing it at cost to themselves. And yet at the same time, they've sort of grown tremendously, and they seem to have played it masterfully over the past 20 years in terms of not just their economic growth, but also their sort of like positioning against America and against the West. Do you directionally agree with that? Do you think it's is there a counterfactual where they had more free trade and things turned out better for them? Did they grow in spite of those policies, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, that is actually a really interesting question of would a counterfactual version of China where maybe they have the same level of political freedom they do now, but they just have a much more free market. Like maybe that does grow a lot faster, or grows faster for a while and then flatlines at some point. It is actually tough to say, but it's also tough to say because part of the China model was that they wanted to subsidize internal investment. So they allowed, like as a policy choice, they allowed corporate profits to be a little bit higher than they otherwise would have been in equilibrium at the expense of wages, because the companies would reinvest those profits and would do so very profitably. There was just tons and tons of unexploited opportunities within the Chinese economy. Like part of China's early growth was just undoing decisions that Mao made, which were, again, like, we're going to trade off current consumption in favor of long-term security, but he traded off a lot of current consumption in favor of long-term security. And one of the ways that Maoist China did that was a part of their early industrial policy was they wanted to make sure that in the event of a war with Russia, their factories would not all get destroyed. And one way to do that is put all your factories in mountains and remote regions and keep them away from population centers, et cetera. And what that means is that every factory is paying this giant logistics tax where you have to drive the truck up the mountain with the inputs, you have to drive it down with the manufactured goods, you have to get the workers there, get them back, et cetera. Like all of very good things to have if your country's getting overrun by the Soviet Union, but otherwise really inconvenient things to have. So after the Soviet threat was not really a threat, you could produce a lot of alpha in China by saying, okay, this tractor factory somehow makes money, even though it's in the middle of nowhere and has to import everything. Like it has to bring all of these, all of the components of these tractors at ludicrous expense over great distances. Like if we just scrap the factory, haul all the equipment to a major city, and rebuild it there, it's going to print money. So that was part of the business model of a lot of those, a lot of the early internal Chinese entrepreneurs was just taking decisions that the state had made that no longer made sense and undoing them. So you get some growth from that. That the free market would probably have done that, although I'm sure some of that factory equipment would have gotten shipped not just within China but to somewhere else. That probably helps somewhat with growth. And yeah, when Chinese policy causes wages to be fairly low and forces workers to save a lot of money because the safety net is pretty skimpy. Like if you want more of like a socialist style safety net, you would want to leave China, move to the United States. If you don't care about unemployment insurance and you don't necessarily need to be able to enroll your kids in a public school and you don't want to have access to medical care if you get sick, being a Chinese worker who does not have the city level hukou, like the residency permit, that's how you get, pretty anarcho-capitalist life. So if you live that anarcho-capitalist life, you have to save a lot of your income because you know that you could lose your job at any time and you have nothing to fall back on. If you're saving your income, you're putting it in the bank because you don't have a lot of other investment opportunities. If it's in the banking system, it's being lent out to companies. So this was a way to just recycle, like not just pay lower wages, but also recycle some of those wages back into capital investment. So it a very investment-driven economic model. And again, lots of low-hanging fruit, lots of ports that should have been more active, should have been more automated and weren't, and lots of road and rail construction that should have been done and wasn't, and lots of factories that needed to be moved from somewhere, from a bad location, put in a good location, et cetera. So for a while, that growth was not quite automatic. Like a lot of people had to work very hard to make it happen, but there was a pretty straightforward path. Now, at this point, China's economy is in a really weird situation where it kind of, in some ways, it does not make sense that it still is running at all because they have massive amounts of leverage throughout the system, basically everywhere except at the level of the central government, which just doesn't issue a lot of debt. But like a lot of the local governments do, a lot of that is off balance sheet borrowing, so very hard to see exactly where the money's going. There are, all of the lending entities are, if they're not state run, they're very heavily state influenced, and you don't really know how much bad debt there is. There's a huge amount of borrowing against real estate whose value has been pretty impaired, and the only real lever for making the value of that real estate go up is putting more liquidity in the financial system, which means expanding all of these already too large balance sheets. And then you compound that with the fact that as the population is shrinking, suddenly there's less demand for real estate every year, or there might be more demand for square meters, but there's less demand for new housing units. So they may have ended up in a situation where they actually are stuck in this long-term quasi-deflationary environment. And at this point, last time I looked, there was a story about this in the FT a couple of days ago that Chinese long-term bonds, like 30-year bonds, actually yield less than Japanese 30-year bonds. So the market is implicitly pricing higher long-term growth expectations for Japan than for China, which is pretty astounding considering those two countries' history over the life of, say, a 30-year bond that just matured today. So it may be that they had a really good model for going from low income to middle income as quickly as possible. Like, you speed run that by having people still have a low income standard of living, even though the GDP stats say they're middle income, which is what a lot of other rapidly developing East Asian economies did. But then that model tells you a lot less about how to go from middle income country, like the average Chinese person being as rich as the average person in Mexico, to being a high income country where they're more comparable to Germany or to the UK or to the US. There are just fewer countries that have made that jump than have made the middle income jump. And if it turns out that you can speed run the process to going to middle income, but then you end up with a Japan style lost decade, but it hits when your country is at a quarter of US GDP per capita instead of 2/3 of US GDP per capita, then maybe in retrospect, just not the right call at all. But in the meantime, the factories are still humming. There are still workers. They're still exporting lots and lots of things all over the world, including to the US. And so you still have to figure out what happens if those exports stop happening, what happens if China's policy priorities change, what happens if they decide that, GDP growth is actually not the party's main source of legitimacy anymore because we can't get GDP growth to, say, at a sustained high level. And so we'll switch to something else, such as our legitimacy is assured because we finally reunited China with the mainland. That would be a pretty bad scenario, but it is a scenario where there can be an economic cause. There was a Deng Xiaoping quote in a biography of him that I read. I think this quote was in a footnote, but he said not just the party's legitimacy is based on GDP growth, but he literally gave a number. He said 4%. That's, if it's above 4%, then the party is the rightful ruler of China. Below 4%, you need some other way to persuade people that you ought to be in charge. And last year, the number was ostensibly +5, but I don't think anyone actually believes the +5. I think there's a good debate to be had over where it is. I think if the state is still trying to fake pretty good-looking numbers, that is at least a sign that they are thinking about what policy maneuvers they could make to actually get to pretty good-looking numbers. But it's still a very worrisome margin of error.
Yeah. You also wrote about how the bond market says that Japan is actually has more growth opportunities than China right now.
Yep. Yeah. Which some of that is just that when you have if you have a very credit-driven growth cycle, then there are going to be bad loans made at the top, and the top is also the point at which balance sheets are biggest. So your last crop of loans is always going to be like the time when the book of loans stops growing is also the time when the last really big bad loans get made. And then you have to work those loans off at some point, and that is some combination of the borrower repays their debt, even though it would make more sense for them to renegotiate, and it would make more sense for the bank to renegotiate, but nobody wants to admit that mistakes were made. Some combination of that and just growth and perhaps some restructuring of loans, or taking all of the banks and having them split into a good bank that has actually made loans with a reasonable chance of performing, and then a bad bank where the government basically bails out and restructures all the loans that are not going to work out. Lots of different approaches there, and usually the approach where everyone just keeps paying the interest and they scrimp and save in order to do that. That tends to lead to very long periods of stagnation. And Japan had one of those. They had a long period where their economy was basically not growing. They also ran into the demographic problem where the working age population was shrinking. And so even though their output per hour was actually pretty much output per hour growth was pretty similar to what it was in the US, but they had fewer of those hours. So Japan did that for a while, and now pretty much all of those loans have been worked off. Like, that particular problem is basically gone. And so now they have a more straightforward growth trajectory where, yeah, the population will shrink over time, but there's still productivity growth, and they still have plenty of industries where they do either they can compete with multinationals headquartered elsewhere, or they are actually the leader in those industries. And it's actually a lot of high value added intermediate goods where Japan does particularly well. So they do have they have basically a lot of the problems that China does, but not that particular credit overhang problem. And so if you flip that around and say China is a country that, like Japan, has peaked in terms of working age population and will have that demographic headwind for a very long time, but also they still have all the bad loans on the books, and so they have to figure out what to do about that. And as long as they haven't really decided what to do about that, as long as they haven't said just we're going to, audit all of the financial institutions in China with assets over some value, and we're going to force everyone to write down the bad loans, and maybe shareholders get wiped out, but maybe we recapitalize some institutions depending. They haven't made that call, and so there's a lot of uncertainty in China about what will be done to address the uncertainty about the long-term trajectory of economic growth. And as long as that's the case, if you are in China, the thing you probably do is buy long-term government bonds. And if you're buying long-term government bonds, you are not investing in real assets. You're not doing anything that stimulates consumption or that increases exports in the future. So what the government can do is just issue a lot more of those bonds. Like the market is telling them you can borrow very, very cheaply. What I have personally thought the Chinese government might do, and what I would probably do in their shoes, is exchange a bunch of this local government off-balance sheet debt for actual government bonds from the central government, couple that with a much stricter oversight from the central government of these provincial governments, because they basically ended up with a system where they had pretty unachievable growth targets, but they could achieve those growth targets through this kind of chicanery, like through borrowing in a semi-official way, or through rezoning property into some more lucrative use case. But it's just a really bad idea to have a system where the thing that makes it work is something that is formally not supposed to be part of the system. You do sometimes have to formalize these things and just admit that the Chinese government writ large owes a lot more money than is reflected on its current balance sheet, but also that China's a big country. They have a huge tax base. They have plenty of very productive industries and plenty of very productive people. So they can still pay those debts. It's just easier to pay them if you admit how big they are and if everyone can measure what the size of the problem is.
Yeah, it's well articulated. I want to segue to a couple other topics before we get out. So one related to the China topic is there anything on TikTok that you're looking out for in terms of, or that you find particularly interesting in terms of what's going to happen there, or what are the dynamics at play?
I mostly think it's funny that this is one of those things where, the coalition formation process continues apace. So banning TikTok was a Trump thing, and then it became a Biden thing, and now saving TikTok is a Trump thing. I don't think he really gets that much credit from either the Chinese Communist Party or from Zoomers who are TikTok addicts. I don't think that many people are going to specifically switch their mind and decide they like Trump over something like this, but it is kind of funny. I also think that TikTok is maybe less of a big issue because Meta decided that it was going to get into short video and was going to do so even if that cost billions of dollars in missed opportunities for higher monetization content in the short term. And they did it, and it worked, and now Reels is plenty big. So you still have the propaganda problem / question of what kinds of content is TikTok promoting and what interests do they have. And the company did, the parent company did at one point get in trouble with the Chinese government for promoting basically world star hip hop type content on their Chinese app. And their then CEO put out a public apology, and he explicitly said that we are going to run this app in a way that promotes socialism with Chinese characteristics. Like they have said that, but that's also, does every American company that's donating to the Trump inaugural, does that mean that that every Meta meeting, like every internal meeting at Meta, is going to start with everyone chanting "Make America Great Again" before they get to business? Probably not. It probably just means that they saw which way the wind was blowing and knew they had to say certain things in order to be viable, and they said those things. But there is still, just if you have an app run by a company whose parent company is in a country which has interests that very much differ from the US and in some cases are actively hostile to US interests. And if that app shapes a lot of public opinion about the US, I think it's a temptation that I'm sure American policymakers have with respect to American media in other countries. And we know that American media could be incredibly influential in other countries. There's this book, The Facebook Effect, one of the first books that was a detailed look at the rise of Facebook. It was written in 2012, and it opens with a chapter that is very, very positive about how Facebook is manipulating the outcomes of elections. But it's an election in Brazil, and I think this was a socialist candidate who was able to organize a lot of supporters on Facebook and able to mobilize them and get out the vote and win the election. And I'm sure someone in the State Department has at least asked these companies about what they're doing about this set of activists in this country and this set in this country. And with Twitter, similarly, some of the early books about Twitter talk about the Arab Spring as this amazing thing that Twitter accomplished. And I think in retrospect, there are certainly inspiring aspects to the Arab Spring, but it also does not seem to have led to a completely different view of human rights in that part of the world. So we can kind of see these apps as potentially somewhat dangerous, even if they are not being actively used as propaganda outlets. And then with TikTok, there's just not, I don't think anyone should have a definitive view unless there is some kind of smoking gun paper trail saying, yes, the algorithm is explicitly being manipulated by the CCP in order to support their interests, or saying, no, the CCP would never do that. I'm sure they would do that, but I don't know that they actually think it's a good risk-adjusted decision to make.
That makes sense. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. And it is fascinating to see the Trump reversal on that. Some people say it was because of the donor makeup, and maybe it's just as simple as that. But yeah, he's interesting to think about.
Something I did find kind of refreshing about the Trump coin thing is like no one can say, oh no, Trump would never do that. It's very, very definitely him. He attached his brand name to it, and we can all look at the wallet and we can see exactly when he dumps the coins, if he does dump the coins. So you're at least bringing some level of transparency to the business of running a griftier political career than one would usually run. Whereas if you look at someone like LBJ, he also, not to nearly the same extent, but he did personally profit a lot from his political career, but it was in the form of he invested in a radio station, and then it turned out that it was really, really hard to get permission to start other radio stations in a similar area. And it also turned out that he just had a lot of pricing power compared to other radio stations. A lot of local advertisers were very, very happy to pay whatever the asking rate was. And so LBJ made some good money in his media business, and of course always promised that this was totally separate from the government job. And you could always speculate about it, but you didn't have the same kind of direct evidence that you have if it is a meme coin that's being promoted by the now president.
Maybe in closing, can you briefly describe this AI SplinterNet? There was a concern that it would be country specific, but in fact, maybe it's been inspired by companies instead.
Yeah. So I started hearing the term SplinterNet, I think around when India did its TikTok ban. And the idea was that what if we just end up with different apps in different countries, and that for some countries, there's maybe like a collection of countries that all use the same set of apps. And then maybe, in Russia, you have a different search engine and a different social network. And in China, of course, you have different search engines and social networks. And what if there end up being just more and more internets? And that seems to have slowed down a lot. Maybe the US will end up being the country where TikTok is not really a thing, but there's still Reels, and a lot of TikToks will still end up being posted to Reels. But in AI terms, what's been happening is that more AI companies are striking licensing deals, sometimes exclusive deals, with particular content providers. And when they do that, it does mean that their model is trained on some set of tokens that other models do not have access to, or at least are not supposed to have access to. So you will end up with different AI tools that actually have different implicit beliefs about the world. And there'll probably be some ongoing selection there, where if someone has the model that gets just lots of exclusive access to, say, academic publications, well, that's probably the one that a lot of people who have really academic questions will want to use. And so it will make less sense for some other model to try to compete along that axis. They just won't be able to get good enough. And also the users who really care will already have switched. Now, as AI becomes more of a default interface, the way that browsers became a default interface, I think that does actually mean that people will have just a very different experience of the world based on which specific data sets the model they use got permission to train on. But also, AI just provides very different experiences for different users because it is something where you have to prompt it, at least in the current incarnation. You prompt it, I'm sure over time, the prompting is going to take the form of the AI is looking at all of the emails you get, all the communications you get, and is also, listening on the microphone and looking with the camera, looking with the glasses, and it's highlighting things to you and, doing some inference based on what it sees. So over time, it will be a little bit less user directed, but for now, you already have a pretty customized AI experience because if you are asking ChatGPT for relationship advice versus asking it for poker strategy advice, you just get very different answers because it's good at answering either kind of question.
That's a good overview. Is there anything we haven't yet covered that you want to make sure we get to, or do you think this is a good place to wrap?
I wish we'd talked more about Donald Trump. No, it is an interesting time. There's an old Clarion Capital letter called "A Bull Market in Politics," and it was maybe earlier, maybe this is just like a long-term swing where private sector had a really, really good run, and it's still very important, but maybe more decisions get made at the level of government. So even though I'm very much a private sector kind of person, really do not want a government job, I still have to pay more attention to what's going on in DC and in Beijing and in many other places than I otherwise would have.
Well, thankfully now that Trump is in office, knowing Trump's demeanor, we won't, it'll be very calm and we won't talk about him and he'll be very reasonable and, we can get back to avoiding politics. Just kidding. I'm sure it'll, consume our lives.
Yes, we'll have to see. I don't know. Maybe he's mellower. Maybe he views this as the last chance to be the Trump he's always wanted to be. But does anyone know who that Trump really is? I guess we'll find out over the next 4 years.
That's true. On that note, Byrne, is always a great conversation. Until next time.
Yes, Steve.
Thanks for listening to The Riff. Please go follow and subscribe, give us 5 stars, and check out Byrne's excellent newsletter, The Diff, if you haven't already.